In 1864, locked in the basement of a Georgia plantation, 23 children were discovered. All of them bore the same distinctive traits: pale green eyes, high cheekbones, and auburn hair streaked with gold. When Union soldiers forced open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, they found these children huddled in the darkness, some approaching adolescence, others as young as 4. The eldest, a girl of 13, told the officers something that made even veteran soldiers physically ill. "Mistress says we are her blood. We cannot leave because we are her legacy." Military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mention this incident just once, in a letter marked confidential and buried in regimental archives for over a century. Local histories of Burke County omit Thornhill Estate entirely, as if its mistress and the plantation itself had never existed. But they did exist. And what Catherine Thornhill created in the 16 years between the arrival of federal troops and her husband's death represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. A systematic breeding program designed to create generations of enslaved people who were genetically tied to their owner and could, therefore, never escape their bondage. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she built in rural Georgia, I need you to do something. If hearing this story is making your skin crawl, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel dives deep into the darkest corners of American history, the secrets buried in forgotten military records and courthouse basements, the stories they don't teach in schools. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me what city or state you're in. Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to where it all began, a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. The widow and the debt. The Thornhill estate sat on 1,700 acres of red clay soil, 7 miles southwest of the county seat, Waynesboro. In 1847, Burke County was cotton country, though less prosperous than the Black Belt regions further west. The soil here was tired, overworked by decades of single-crop farming. Plantations that had flourished in the 1820s were struggling by the 1840s, squeezed between rising costs and falling cotton prices. Labors had been drawn away by the Mexican War, and talk of territorial expansion divided communities along bitter lines. Thornhill Estate had once been among the more successful properties in the region. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan Thornhill, had inherited it from his father in 1838 with manageable debt, adequate equipment, and 42 enslaved workers. But Jonathan had been an enthusiastic gambler and a poor manager. By the time a winter fever claimed him in February 1847, creditors were circling like buzzards, and the estate was mortgaged to the hilt. The fields were barely producing enough to feed the workers. Catherine was 28 when she became a widow. She had married Jonathan when she was 19, a strategic match arranged by her father, Theodore Danforth, a prominent Augusta merchant. The Danforths were old Georgia money, descended from settlers who arrived in the 1730s. Catherine had been educated by private tutors, spoke French passably well, and had been raised with expectations of managing a substantial household. What she had not expected was to inherit a failing plantation with crushing debts, along with a 16-year-old son who looked at her with something approaching hatred. Richard Thornhill was Jonathan's son from his first marriage. His mother had died giving birth to him in 1831, and Jonathan had remarried 5 years later. Richard had never warmed to Catherine, viewing her as an interloper who had replaced his real mother. He was a sullen, bookish boy who spent most of his time in the estate's small library, avoiding both the practical work of running a plantation and his stepmother. Catherine found him weak, impractical, and entirely too sentimental about the enslaved workers. He had once suggested they should be taught to read, an idea so dangerous that Catherine had forbidden him from speaking of it again. The plantation itself reflected its declining fortunes. The main house was a 2-story structure of whitewashed brick with 6 columns across the front portico, built in 1805 in the Federal style. Paint peeled from the window frames and the roof leaked in 3 places. The furniture inside was a mix of inherited pieces from Jonathan's family and cheaper replacements, purchased when the good pieces had been sold to pay gambling debts. Behind the main house stood the overseer's cottage, the dairy, the smokehouse, and the kitchen building, all in similar states of disrepair. Further back, beyond a line of live oaks draped with Spanish moss, were the quarters where the enslaved population lived. In 1847, 31 people remained on the property, 7 children, 13 women, and 11 men. 16 others had been sold off over the previous 3 years to satisfy Jonathan's creditors. Those who remained knew that more sales were coming. Fear hung over the quarters like fog over the Savannah River. The cultivation plan. Catherine spent the first month after Jonathan's death in a kind of controlled fury. She met with Ambrose Talbot, the estate's lawyer, who laid out her options in blunt terms: sell the property and the remaining workers to settle the debts and perhaps have enough left over to live modestly in Augusta under her father's roof, or find some way to make the plantation profitable again. Given the estate's depleted resources and the state of the cotton market, Talbot considered the latter unlikely. Neither option was acceptable to Catherine. Returning to Augusta would mean admitting failure, living as a dependent spinster in her father's house, forever marked as the widow who couldn't hold onto her inheritance. But she also recognized that traditional plantation management wouldn't save Thornhill Estate. The land was worn out. The equipment was old. The remaining enslaved workers were insufficient in number to work the cotton fields profitably, and she had no money to purchase more. It was during one of these sleepless nights, poring over the estate's account books by candlelight, that Catherine conceived her plan. The idea came to her with the cold logic of desperation. If she couldn't afford to purchase workers, she would breed them. But not in the haphazard way most plantations did it, offering minor incentives for couples to have children and waiting 15 years for those children to become productive laborers. No, Catherine envisioned something far more controlled, more systematic. She would create a population of workers who were biologically tied to the estate, who could never be sold because they were her own descendants, who would have an instinctive loyalty to the plantation because it was literally in their blood. The plan was monstrous. But to Catherine, it was also elegant. She was still young enough to bear children. She would select the strongest, healthiest men among the enslaved population and conceive children with them. These children would be raised knowing their parentage, would be given slightly better treatment than the others to ensure their loyalty, and when they reached maturity, would be paired with enslaved women to produce the next generation. Catherine calculated she could have a workforce of 50 or more within 20 years, all bound to Thornhill Estate by ties that went deeper than legal ownership. Seeds of deception. She began keeping a journal to work out the details. This was no diary of personal feelings. Catherine was far too practical for that. Instead, she created what she called her cultivation records, filled with plans, observations, and calculations. She wrote in a simple substitution cipher, replacing key words with innocuous agricultural terms. Children became seedlings. The men she selected became rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. The journal's pages were covered with diagrams that looked like breeding charts for livestock, because that was essentially what they were. Catherine's first selection was a man named Isaac, 24 years old, born on the plantation and known for his steady temperament and physical strength. She summoned him to the main house on a March evening in 1847 after the other workers had retired to the quarters. What happened that night was recorded in Catherine's journal only as first planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild. She summoned him again 3 weeks later and then twice more before the month ended. By April, Catherine was confident she was pregnant. She recorded this in her journal with the same emotional detachment she might note the planting of cotton, initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Richard Thornhill first suspected something was wrong with his stepmother in late May of 1847. He noticed she had stopped taking her morning rides around the property, claiming the heat bothered her, even though the Georgia summer had barely begun. She took her meals in her room more frequently and had dismissed the house servant who usually attended her, preferring to manage her own affairs. For a woman as concerned with appearances as Catherine, this withdrawal was unusual. But it was a conversation Richard overheard in early June that truly alarmed him. He had been in the library, hidden behind one of the tall bookcases, when Catherine met with Miriam Grayson in the adjacent parlor. Mrs. Grayson was the local midwife, a sharp-featured woman of 50 who attended births for both white and enslaved families throughout Burke County. Richard knew her slightly. She had a reputation as a skilled practitioner, but also as someone who kept confidences and asked few questions. "You're certain of your condition?" Mrs. Grayson asked in her clipped professional tone. "Quite certain," Catherine replied. "I should think sometime in early December." "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said?" There was a pause. Richard pressed himself against the bookcase, hardly breathing. "My late husband and I were intimate in January, shortly before his final illness," Catherine said evenly. Of course, Mrs. Grayson's voice carried a note of careful neutrality, not quite disbelief. "I'll need to examine you properly, and we should discuss the arrangements for the delivery. Will you want me here at the house?" "I will, and I'll need your discretion, Miriam." "Absolutely. You have it, as always." Richard waited until both women had left the room before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were shaking. The mathematics didn't work. His father had been bedridden for the entire month of January, barely conscious most days, racked with chills and fever. Richard had sat with him many nights. There had been no possibility of intimate relations between his father and Catherine, which meant the child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death, in March or April, with someone else. The poisoned air. The implications made Richard sick to his stomach. If word got out that Catherine had conceived a child out of wedlock, the scandal would destroy what little remained of the family's reputation. Creditors would move immediately to seize the property. The Danforth family in Augusta would disown her. But beyond the practical consequences, Richard was appalled by the deception itself. Catherine intended to claim this child as his father's legitimate heir, to build her future on a foundation of fraud, to lie to everyone. He considered his options. He could confront Catherine directly, but he was only 16, and she held all legal authority over the estate. He could go to Lawyer Talbot in Waynesboro, but without proof, it would be his word against Catherine's, and as a minor, his testimony would carry little weight. He could write to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta, but Catherine read all outgoing mail from the estate. Instead, Richard began to watch Catherine carefully, trying to understand what she was planning, looking for evidence. He noticed that she summoned Isaac to the main house regularly, always after dark, always when the overseer was away in town or occupied with duties elsewhere on the property. He saw how Catherine's manner toward Isaac was different from her treatment of other enslaved workers, less overtly hostile, not kind exactly. She spoke to him in full sentences rather than curt commands. By July, Richard was certain Isaac was the father of Catherine's child. The realization filled him with horror, not just at the violation of social and legal boundaries, but at what it revealed about Catherine's character. She had coldly, deliberately chosen to conceive a child with an enslaved man, to claim that child as her late husband's, and to maintain this lie indefinitely. What kind of woman was capable of such calculated deception? He found part of the answer in early August during one of Catherine's rare trips to Waynesboro. Richard had been searching for legal documents related to the estate, with vague thoughts of finding something that might give him leverage over Catherine, when he discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a locked drawer of Catherine's writing desk. The lock was simple enough for a determined 16-year-old to pick. The journal was written in cipher, but Richard had always been good with puzzles. It took him 3 days, working in secret whenever Catherine was out of the house, to crack the basic substitution pattern. What he read made his blood run cold. Catherine wasn't just having an affair with Isaac, she was implementing a deliberate breeding program. The journal laid it out in chilling detail, her plan to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men, to raise those children as part of the plantation workforce, and eventually to breed those children with each other and with other enslaved people to create an ever-expanding population of workers who would be genetically tied to Thornhill Estate and to Catherine herself. There were charts, calculations of expected births over 5-year periods, notes on which men displayed desirable physical characteristics, speculation about whether traits like strength, intelligence, and temperament were heritable. It read like something from a livestock breeder's manual, except the livestock were human beings. Richard copied several pages of the journal, translating the cipher into plain English, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. This was evidence. This was proof of Catherine's depravity. He could expose her. He could take this to the authorities. But that night at dinner, Catherine looked at him with those cold green eyes and said casually, "Richard, have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem to have been disturbed." "No," Richard lied, his throat tight. "I keep certain documents locked away for good reason," Catherine continued, cutting her meat with precise strokes. "If I ever found that someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I'm afraid I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good. Because family loyalty is everything, Richard. Everything. Without it, we're simply animals tearing at each other." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know you loved your father very much. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household." The threat was clear. If Richard tried to expose Catherine, she would find a way to turn it back on him, to paint him as a disturbed, resentful stepson inventing lies about a grieving widow. Who would people believe? A respected plantation mistress from a prominent family, or an awkward teenage boy with known resentment toward his stepmother? Richard returned to his room that night and burned the pages he had copied, but he kept watching Catherine, and he began to feel increasingly unwell. It started with fatigue. By September, Richard found himself exhausted by mid-afternoon, unable to focus on his books. His appetite diminished. He developed frequent headaches that made it difficult to think clearly. By October, he was experiencing occasional stomach pains and muscle weakness. Catherine showed great concern. She insisted Richard stay in bed. She prepared his meals herself, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of soft foods. She summoned Mrs. Grayson to examine him. The midwife, who also served as a general medical practitioner in the absence of a proper physician, diagnosed nervous exhaustion complicated by possible consumption. She prescribed rest, fresh air when Richard felt strong enough, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta. "Tuberculosis often strikes young men of sensitive disposition," Catherine told Richard, adjusting his pillows with attentive care. "Your father had a cousin who died of it at just your age. We must be very vigilant." Richard knew better. He had read about arsenic poisoning during his hours in the library. He recognized the symptoms in himself: the fatigue, the digestive troubles, the muscle weakness. Catherine was slowly killing him, eliminating the one person who knew her secret and posed a threat to her plans, disguising murder as disease. But he was too weak to fight back, too isolated to get help. The house servants followed Catherine's orders absolutely. The overseer rarely came to the main house. Richard's room was on the second floor, and by November he barely had the strength to get out of bed, let alone escape the property and reach Waynesboro. He made one final attempt to expose Catherine in late November, writing a letter to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta. It took him 3 days to compose it, working for a few minutes at a time before exhaustion overwhelmed him. He described Catherine's breeding program, her journal, the poisoning. He sealed the letter and gave it to one of the younger house servants, a girl named Pearl, begging her to post it in Waynesboro without telling Catherine. Pearl took the letter, but she also told Catherine, terrified of what would happen if the mistress discovered she'd been keeping secrets. Catherine read the letter expressionless, then burned it in the fireplace in front of Richard. "You're very ill, darling," she said softly, almost tenderly. "The fever is affecting your mind. You're imagining things that aren't real. It's a mercy really that you won't have to suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3, 1847, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. Dr. Samuel Pritchard from Waynesboro, summoned to record the death, noted consumption as the cause and remarked that the young man had wasted away with tragic speed. Catherine wept decorously at the funeral. She wore black for a full year. The harvest of fear. For days after Richard's burial, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. She named him Jonathan after her late husband and claimed he had been born slightly premature, which explained any questions about timing. Few people in Burke County thought to count backwards from the birth to Catherine's widowhood. Those who did kept their speculations to themselves. It was not the kind of thing one discussed openly. The years between 1848 and 1856 transformed Thornhill Estate in ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. The plantation that had teetered on the edge of bankruptcy slowly regained its footing. Cotton production increased. The enslaved workforce grew. Catherine Thornhill earned a reputation as a shrewd, if somewhat reclusive, plantation mistress who managed her property with uncommon efficiency. But that efficiency came at a terrible cost that no outsider ever saw. Catherine gave birth for more times between 1848 and 1853, daughters named Abigail, Eleanina, and Margaret, and another son she called Samuel. Each birth was attended only by Miriam Grayson, who by now was deeply complicit in Catherine's schemes. The midwife received generous payment for her services and her silence, regular fees that far exceeded her normal rates, plus a small cottage on the edge of the Thornhill property where she could live without paying rent. Mrs. Grayson's role extended far beyond delivering Catherine's children. She also performed a darker function, ensuring that enslaved women on the property only gave birth to children who fit Catherine's careful plans. When pregnancies occurred outside Catherine's controlled pairings, and they did, because human beings will form intimate relationships and attachments, even in the most oppressive circumstances, Mrs. Grayson provided abortifacients, plant-based compounds that induced miscarriages. She performed these procedures in a small room behind the overseer's cottage, away from witnesses and the main house. The women subjected to these forced abortions rarely spoke of them, even to each other. The grief was unvoiceable, the trauma profound in a system that already denied them autonomy over their own bodies. But whispers circulated through the quarters anyway. Stories of women who had been pregnant one week and bleeding the next, who were told they had simply lost the babies naturally, though everyone knew Mrs. Grayson had been involved. One woman named Ruth tried to resist. In the spring of 1851, she was 5 months pregnant when Catherine discovered that the father was not the man Catherine had designated for her, but instead a young field hand named Samuel, with whom Ruth had formed a genuine attachment. Catherine ordered Mrs. Grayson to terminate the pregnancy immediately. Ruth ran. She made it nearly 4 miles into the pine forest southwest of the plantation before the overseer's dogs tracked her down. She was dragged back to Thornhill Estate, held down by 2 men while Mrs. Grayson forcibly administered the abortifacient compounds. Ruth survived the ordeal physically, but something fundamental broke inside her. She worked mechanically after that, spoke rarely, and died 2 years later during a fever outbreak that swept through the quarters. She was 24 years old. The special children. But Ruth's tragedy was just one among many. By 1856, Catherine's program had produced 7 children of her own, all of whom were being raised in a peculiar liminal space. They were legally enslaved. Catherine had registered them as such in the county records, claiming them as children born to enslaved women on the property, which gave her legal ownership of them, but in practice, they lived in the main house, wore decent clothes, ate better food than the other enslaved children, and received informal education from Catherine herself. Young Jonathan, the eldest, was 8 years old in 1856. He was a serious, quiet child who resembled Catherine strongly, the same sharp features, the same auburn hair, the same green eyes. He had no memory of his father, Isaac, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849. Catherine had found Isaac's presence a complication once his purpose had been served. The money from his sale helped pay down some of the estate's remaining debts. The younger children knew nothing of their true parentage. Catherine told them they were fortunate orphans whom she had taken into her household out of Christian charity. She taught them to read and write, a dangerous illegality in Georgia, where teaching enslaved people literacy was prohibited by law. But Catherine was confident no one from the outside would ever enter her home and discover what she was teaching these children. She was grooming them, preparing them for the next phase of her plan. But that phase required patience. The children needed to reach physical maturity before they could be used for breeding. Catherine continued her meticulous record-keeping, tracking their growth, their health, their temperaments. She noted which children seemed more intelligent, which showed physical strength, which were more compliant. She was planning pairings decades in advance. In the meantime, she continued having children of her own. 3 more were born between 1854 and 1856, sons named William and Henry and a daughter called Caroline. Each had a different father, carefully selected from among the enslaved men on the property. Catherine's criteria were ruthlessly practical: good eyesight, decent teeth, physical health, strength, no obvious impairments. She cared nothing for their characters or personalities. They were, in her mind, simply genetic material to be utilized. The men themselves had no choice in the matter. When Catherine summoned them to the main house, they came, knowing that refusal would mean sale or brutal punishment. Some of them understood what was happening, that the children Catherine bore would be their own biological offspring, even as those children would be raised to think of Catherine as their benefactor and savior. The psychological torture of this situation was extreme. They were forced to become fathers to children they could never protect, never parent, never acknowledge. One man named Thomas was summoned to the main house in 1855. He was 26 years old, married to a woman named Hannah who lived in the quarters and was pregnant with their first child. When Thomas learned that Catherine intended to use him for breeding, he tried to refuse. The overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Kane, had Thomas whipped in front of the assembled enslaved population, 39 lashes that left his back scarred for life. Then Catherine had him brought to the main house anyway. Thomas complied. He had no other choice. But he never spoke to Hannah about what happened in the main house, and Hannah never asked. Some knowledge was too poisonous to voice. Abomination as innovation. By 1856, Thornhill Estate housed a population that looked normal on the surface but was actually structured along Catherine's twisted logic. There were the field workers, about 20 adults and their children, who worked the corn and cotton under the overseer's supervision. There were the house servants, 1 elderly man and 3 women, who cleaned, cooked, and maintained the domestic space. And then there were Catherine's special children, 10 in total by 1856, ranging in age from infancy down to 8 years old. These children occupied a strange position in the plantation hierarchy. The other enslaved people resented them for their privileges, but also pitied them for what they represented. Everyone in the quarters understood on some level what Catherine was doing. They didn't have language for breeding programs or eugenics, those terms would come later, but they recognized the pattern. They saw how Catherine kept detailed records of the children, how she measured them periodically, how she noted their development in her locked journal, and they waited with a kind of horrified anticipation for what would happen when these children grew up. Because everyone knew what Catherine intended. She had made it clear in subtle ways, in comments and instructions. These children were being raised to produce the next generation of workers. They were tools in Catherine's long-term plan to create a workforce that could never be sold, could never leave, because they were genetically bound to her and to Thornhill Estate. It was an abomination disguised as innovation. But in the isolated world of a rural Georgia plantation in the 1850s, with absolute power concentrated in the hands of the property owner and no outside oversight, Catherine was able to pursue her vision without interference. The only person who posed any potential threat was Talbot, the lawyer in Waynesboro, who handled the estate's legal affairs and thus had access to records that might raise questions. But Talbot was a practical man who valued profitable clients. And by 1856, Thornhill Estate was becoming profitable. Debts were being paid down. The workforce was growing through Catherine's breeding program at no acquisition cost. Talbot asked no uncomfortable questions because he benefited from Catherine's success. The isolation of the plantation helped maintain secrecy. Thornhill Estate was 7 miles from Waynesboro, connected by a rough road that was often impassable in winter. Neighbors were few, the nearest plantation was 3 miles away. Catherine rarely entertained visitors and discouraged social calls. When she did interact with other plantation families, usually at occasional gatherings in Waynesboro or at church on Sundays, she presented herself as a proper widow, managing her late husband's property with practical wisdom and Christian virtue. No one suspected the systematic horror occurring behind the whitewashed brick walls of the main house and in the quarters beyond the oak trees. And even if they had suspected, would they have cared? This was Georgia in the 1850s, a society built on the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor. Catherine's program was more coldly calculated, more systematic than most, but it was not fundamentally different in kind from what happened on thousands of other plantations across the South. That was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire situation. Catherine's breeding program was monstrous, but it was also logical within the framework of a society that already treated human beings as property to be bred, sold, and bought at will. She had simply taken the underlying logic of slavery and followed it to one of its most horrifying conclusions. But systems built on such profound injustice contain the seeds of their own destruction. Change was coming to Georgia and the entire South, though in 1856, few people could imagine how violently or how soon it would arrive. The Heritage Room. The late 1850s brought increasing tensions to all of Georgia and Burke County. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories dominated national politics. The violence in Kansas Territory, where anti-slavery and pro-slavery settlers were literally killing each other, was discussed in anxious tones at the courthouse in Waynesboro. The presidential election of 1856, which put James Buchanan in office, did little to resolve the fundamental conflicts tearing the country apart. Catherine paid little attention to politics. Her focus remained fixed on her long-term program and Thornhill estate. By 1859, her eldest children were approaching adolescence. Jonathan was 11, Elenina was 10, Abigail was 9. They were still too young for the breeding phase of Catherine's plan, but she was already making preparations, already selecting which of the enslaved young women would be appropriate partners when the time came. It was during this period that Catherine constructed what she called the Heritage Room in a previously unused section of the mansion's east wing. She told the house servants it would be a storage space for family records and memorabilia. In reality, it was a shrine to her breeding program. The room was windowless, lit by oil lamps, with a large table in the center and walls lined with shelves. On the shelves, Catherine stored her coded journals, 3 leather-bound volumes by 1859, chronicling every pairing, every birth, every observation about the children's development. She also kept small glass vials, each labeled with a name and a date, containing locks of hair from each child. These samples were arranged in rows organized by parentage and generation, a physical archive of her genetic experiments. On the table, Catherine had drawn elaborate family trees in ink, showing not actual family relationships, but her planned pairings for future generations. Lines connected names with notations about anticipated outcomes.